Afternoon. I'm Susan Pharr. I'm director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations, and I'm very delighted to welcome you to a whole series, and this is one of a whole series of events we're having right now. May I mention that this symposium really is results from a grant that we received from the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership. We applied for a 3-year grant that would look at Japan in the 21st century. In year 1, looking at the future of the region, East Asia. The second year, looking at the problem of inequality in Japan and other advanced industrial countries. And in the third year, looking at the role of citizens in governance in Japan in comparative perspective, looking at really the role of civic life, voters, public opinion in Japan. So this is really the first year of the grant that began last December. We're grateful to CGP for the funding for it. And may I mention that fortuitously, there are a lot of events sort of coming together at one time as a result, really, of Golden Week in Japan, that period where 4 national holidays come together, including Greenery Day, an environmental day recognizing the environment. They come together in a way that makes it possible for very busy people to travel. So we're very fortunate that we've had several visitors who could join us, including 2 members of the upper house of the Japanese Diet. May I just mention, this morning we had a seminar by one of them, Yoshimasa Hayashi, of the upper house, a former Minister of Defense and also Minister of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, who talked about the TPP, the Transatlantic Partnership, including where Japan's view of it, including what is being the reaction in agriculture to that agreement. And then next Monday, we'll be having the final event of our series, which is an upper house member, Masako Mori, who is, she is formerly Minister of State for Gender Equality and now Minister of State for Consumer Affairs and Food Safety. She is from Fukushima, and she'll be talking about womenomics and also about Fukushima and generally the issue of food safety, and more recently about the events in Kumamoto. So that's ahead. Now today we have really the centerpiece of our sort of spread of events, this colloquium, and it is co-sponsored today by the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, and we're delighted that its director, Ted Bester, is with us, Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, the Korea Institute, the Harvard University Asia Center, and the Harvard Kennedy School Japan Caucus, and finally, Japan Society of Boston. So let me now turn to our symposium, the title of which is, Where is East Asia Headed? Recently, I was reading a description of a project that the Weatherhead Center here has on the Atlantic Basin. And it describes that basin as a collection of interactions between peoples, civic organizations, corporations, governments, and other actors in the region, which operate at all levels, at the level of politics and diplomacy, exchange of goods and services, transfer of ideas, energy supply and demand, security, migration, and many others. So all of that describing the Atlantic, but could equally well describe the Pacific area. But then we come to another sentence that gives one pause. Speaking of the Atlantic Basin, it says, in these complex interactions, one can detect, holding it together, a marked transatlantic character, a sense of community that is shaped by history, language, and geography. And here, I think, is the troubling aspect of what we have in the Asia-Pacific, a region that is unsettled, dynamic, and evolving, but in very, very complex ways. And we experience this as a program on U.S.-Japan relations, putting together this photograph. Should Obama be at the kind of the center? Where should Abe be? Should he be next to the president of South Korea? Should we include Taiwan's president? That's a political question. So, and should we include Kim, Mr. Kim from North Korea, Kim Jong-un, in a way because he is, in relation to the community I'm just describing, he is a community breaker, not a community maker. So all of this is very complex, and today we're very delighted to have together a really outstanding group of panelists. Our lead-off panelist is Mr. Akio Takahara, who is from University of Tokyo. He's a professor in the Graduate School of Law and Politics. He is also Vice Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy. He's also a senior fellow at the Tokyo Foundation. At Harvard, he is well known to us. He was a visitor in the Fairbanks Center for 2005 and 6, just as, in fact, this building was opening in the first year of this building. He also is serving on this particular occasion, not only as a visitor to be on the panel, but as the program's distinguished visitor, therefore someone we choose annually to honor, and he is the 29th annual visitor, the distinguished visitor of the program this year. He is Japan's one of his leading scholars of China and of Chinese political economy and foreign relations, and certainly Japanese-Chinese relations and the international relations of East Asia. He has published a tremendous amount, including over 100 articles, and he has been really a pivotal person for writing about and interpreting China within Japan. We have 3 other panelists, and their actual order we will decide a little bit flexibly because our second listed panelist, Victor Cha, is on his way. He was a bit delayed, and he should be arriving momentarily, but let me just go ahead and introduce him now. He is a professor at Georgetown University. He is the director of their Asian Studies program, and he holds the D.S. Song KF Endowed Chair in International Affairs and is professor of government. He too has a Harvard connection, and from 1992 to 94, he was with the Weatherhead Center in a program that we then had called the Olin Institute for Strategic Studies, where he was a security fellow. From 2004 to 2007, he was Director for Asian Affairs at the White House on the National Security Council, responsible primarily for Japan, the Korean Peninsula, Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island nations. May I just mention one forthcoming book he has called Power Play, The Origins of the American Alliance System in Asia, which will be coming out from Princeton. Also on the panel is Sheila Smith, who is a senior fellow for Japanese studies at the Council on Foreign Relations based in Washington. She is an adjunct professor of Asian Studies, the Asian Studies Department at Georgetown. She previously was here at Boston University, and she was an associate of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations, a faculty associate. And 2 years ago, she was the distinguished visitor of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Her research looks at Japanese domestic politics and foreign policy in the Philippines, Korea, U.S. military bases rather in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. And she too has published on Japanese-Chinese relations, quite recently, a book called Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China, published last year. Zheng Wang, our final panelist, is senior faculty member at Seton Hall University in the School of Diplomacy and International Relations. His bachelor's is from Beijing University, and he has a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University. He has a book that of many publications, let me simply mention a book that he has called Never Forget National Humiliation, a book published by Columbia that was the winner of the Ferguson Award, the Best Book of the Year award presented by the International Studies Association. So let me now turn things over to our panel, and we'll start with our first panelist and then see where we are in terms of Victor's arrival.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Professor Pharr, for your kind introduction. And I would also like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the program on U.S.-Japan relations and all the co-organizers for inviting me, and particularly to Professor Pharr and Professor Shin Fujihira. to make me come here and share this important panel with my distinguished fellow panelists. I'm so honored to be here today, this afternoon. Now, I understand that my task here is to talk about how Japan sees China's rise, which is a very important topic, not only for the Japanese, but for the people in the region, peoples in the region, and I suppose for the world. And I'd like to start by picking up on Minister Wang Yi's remarks that he made at the recent National People's Congress held last month in Beijing. And Mr. Wang Yi is well known as a Japan expert in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, but he was very critical about Japan, calling Japan Janus-faced, having two faces. And what he meant was that Japan often comes to China, Chinese leaders, and say that the Japanese really would like to improve relations with China, but at the same time, they are very critical of China on certain fronts, for example, what they do in the South China Sea. And they could not but doubt the sincerity in the words of the Japanese when they say they want to improve ties with China. But having listened to this, it occurred to me that what we Japanese are doing is very similar to what the Chinese are doing, for example, towards North Korea. In the same foreign press conference that he had, Mr. Wang Yi also talked about his North Korea policies and said that on the one hand, they pay much attention to their ties, their moral commitments. In Chinese, it was jiang qing yi. But on the other hand, they also pay much attention to principles. They jiang yuanze. And that is exactly what Japan is doing towards China, I would say. And let me explain. On the one side, Japan welcomes China's economic rise. There's no doubt about that. And the Japanese have supported Chinese economic rise very forcefully. For instance, we have provided an enormous amount of ODA to China, which amounts to 3 trillion Japanese yen. And on our side, we also benefit a lot from China's economic rise. There's no doubt about that also. For example, let's take up the sales of cars, automobiles. From January to November last year, Japanese automobile firms increased their sales by 8.8% compared to the previous year. And that compares to the American car enterprises, which only increased their sales by 1.1%, German firms by a minus 1.5%, and the Korean firms by minus 7.5%. If you go to Beijing, you would see for yourself how much more Japanese cars you see on the roads in Beijing. And if the Chinese economy falters, Japan, together with many other countries, would be in a big trouble. But on the other hand, the Japanese oppose Chinese actions that breach international agreements and international norms. We are very unhappy about the Chinese sending their patrol boats into the territorial waters around the Senkakus 3 times a month. They have kept up with this pace. And we are rather unhappy about the Chinese constructing these artificial islands in the South China Sea, which is a clear breach of the 2002 Declaration of Conduct that the Chinese have signed with the other littoral nations surrounding the South China Sea. So for the Japanese, it seems that what some Chinese would like to see in the region, the new Pax Sinica, as it were, that some people in China envisage, is an extension of the domestic order that they have within China, which I call Pax Communista, because it is a domestic order that is not supported by rule of law, but rather by the outstanding power of the Chinese Communist Party. And if that is the order, kind of order that we would see in the future in the region, I don't think many people would be happy about that. So That's one concern that is shared by many Japanese, and therefore the Japanese government cannot but hedge against the risks that we feel. We didn't feel any security threats from China for a very long time. And it's only recently, after they started this intrusion into the territorial waters around the Senkakus, that many Japanese, for the first time, have begun to feel this immediate threat, security threat from China. And the Chinese tend to blame Mr. Abe for the changes in the Japanese security policy. But I would argue that if it was somebody different in the premiership, would he or she be taking a different security policy? I don't really think so. Of course, it is for peace, but too quick a pace in the change of balance of power in the region, I think, is not good for the stability of the regional order. And anybody who would succeed Mr. Abe, I believe, would follow the same line of the security policies that the current administration has been taking. Now, the next topic is, will China change as a result of its rise? And if it will, then in what way? How will China change? I think there is a debate within the United States also, about whether China will change or China will not change. And in the past, it seems many people were rather optimistic, hoping and believing that China will change as its economic standards rise, and the political system eventually will be changing. But nowadays, the other argument, that is China will not change, seems to be rising, not only in the United States, but elsewhere, including Japan. So on the one hand, there are people in Japan who tend to think that as China grows, as China increases its national power, it will just become more active, particularly on the maritime front. It will become more nationalistic internally, and also assertively. They will act more assertively externally and try to promote its interests that is expanding overseas. Now, for those people, the Chinese seem to believe only in power and money. There's not much respect for norms and rules. And it seems the Chinese leaders believe that once they are more powerful, once they are richer, then the neighboring nations will just begin to defer to the Chinese, which I personally don't really think that's the case. But anyway, the other argument is that eventually China will have to change. China is changing. China will enter the stage of a postmodern society and overcome the paradigm of, in Chinese, is 富民强国, or in Japanese, 富国強兵, that is, to increase the military and economic power of the country. Japan has its own experience in being fixated with this paradigm, and China, in the midst of modernization, is right in this stage. But eventually, China will come out of this historical stage. And for instance, there are these two different views. And for instance, they have different attitudes toward the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Some people in Japan are very cautious about joining the AIIB, arguing that, well, the governance is not very clear. They're not setting up this permanent board of members in Beijing. And we'll have to wait and see whether they'll be performing in a proper way by the standards of the international financial community. But on the other hand, there are those who would rather argue that we should join the AIIB because it is going to be a very good learning process for the Chinese to do things according to the international standards. And I tend to be on the latter side, arguing that AIIB, in fact, has already changed Chinese attitudes. For instance, at the beginning, maybe the intention of creating a new international financial order was at the forefront of things. But I think Mr. Jin Liqun, the president, and his Chinese staff have realized that if they didn't follow the standards of international financial world, then the ratings would be very low, and also they wouldn't be able to come up with projects that meet the standards, that meet the needs of the local societies who could protest against the moving of people because of the creation of dams or whatever. So we have already seen some changes on that front. Now, which side will have the upper hand in Japanese politics? I think at the moment, the Japanese government is pretty serious about coming up with ideas and ways to improve relations with China. And I think many of you know that at this very moment, our Foreign Minister Kishida is visiting Beijing. And this is a meeting between two foreign ministers after an interval of 4.5 years. And the Chinese have changed their policies towards Japan in 2014, partly because of economic needs. So economic needs so far has been a positive factor in promoting Japan-China relations. The Chinese realize that political tension can affect economic exchange in a negative way. But what if the economic downturn in China becomes more serious and there'll be more instability in Chinese society? Will Xi Jinping be tempted to resort to arousing nationalistic sentiments in order to increase his centripetal power, centripetal force? I think on that question, we still have to wait and see. I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussions later. Thank you very much.
So let us proceed with our next presenter. Zheng Wang will now come up, and hopefully Victor will be arriving shortly.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Susan and Singh, for your invitation. And I'm very honored to come here and join the discussion. In the past 3 years, I think Mr. Xi Jinping has kept all the China scholars busy with all the new initiative, new behavior, and a new policy shift. And China's foreign policy is indeed quite different, even compared with the period of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. And many people are talking about that Xi Jinping's foreign policy is already, abandoned somehow Deng Xiaoping's long-term foreign policy of low profile and hiding, waiting for time, the Taoguang Yanghui foreign policy. So it's, I know that there's a lot of debates about China, and people are talking about tipping point of U.S.-China relations. I think it is indeed a tipping point for people to understand China's future orientation, and it's a tipping point of perception. Also, people related with China's foreign policy with domestic politics. We can say that in recent years, it's indeed we have more and more this kind of reports about the government is tightening the screw of the repression and censorship. So how do you understand this new behavior, new activities, and new policy? I think this is really a very critical moment. And actually, I'm really concerned about a major misjudgment and misunderstandings about China's future move. We know if we put it on the larger background of the East Asia, we know that in the first 3 decades after World War II, actually more than 3 out of 4 people killed in war were killed in the big East Asian region. But since 1980, this region has been relatively peaceful. And we have also witnessed the major development and the rise of the East Asia. And also, I put it here, the share of the global battle deaths from 1980 to 2008 was less than 5%. So it's a big question now people asking about is, will the East Asian peace last? I think the next 5 years probably is a quite dangerous period of time. For particular, of course, there's more than these two reasons I listed here. I think one of the reasons I will talk today is that when nationalism, the rise of nationalism meet with the rise of the maritime disputes, and also the ambitious leaders. Sometimes it's okay when you have one or two ambitious leaders, but unfortunately, it seems that we got more than one or two. So they happen to be in power at the same time. I have no intention to make connection with the U.S. election with security in East Asia, but it's interesting that several weeks ago, a Chinese journalist interviewed me about the U.S. election, and he asked me a question. He said, "What is the best way to translate 'Make my country great again'?" And we just talking about several wording, which one is better. But I suddenly realized, "Make my country great again" is actually quite similar with what Xi Jinping's Chinese dream. After Xi came into power, he said that Chinese dream is like his major policy platform. And he said, what his Chinese dream is realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So, rejuvenation, 复兴，中华民族的伟大复兴. It seems like exactly is make my country great again. So to some extent, I don't know whether you agree with me, I think in East Asia or in the Asia-Pacific region, there is such kind of make my country great again nationalism. And this is a nationalism of the rise and fall of the great powers. And we can say something, for example, in the Japanese domestic narrative, there's also this kind of discussion about whether people using the different terms, whether it's restoration or rejuvenation. You can find something similar from Putin's speech, from Modi's speech, similar like that. Is people are trying to focus on make their country great again. And so, to some extent, I will say the China-Japan, of course, we talked about the bilateral relationship. There's on the surface, there are a lot of national interest, geopolitical clashes. But fundamentally, I think the source of the tension is kind of like a clash of the dreams or clash of identities. It's very much shaped by their different perceptions and identities. My task is to talk more about Chinese nationalism. I think when we talk about Chinese nationalism, it's quite important there's different dimensions of nationalism. From the social psychology, attitude and emotion, to the social discourse, to the domestic politics and party-state relationship, and also foreign relations. One of my long-term arguments is that I think Chinese nationalism is basically a mis-trauma nationalism. A group of people, they're very proud of their achievement and civilization, and they suffered what is the so-called 100 national humiliation. So they have such kind of a strong sense of history. And also because of that, they are very sensitive to any territory and sovereignty issues, such as South China Sea. And also the if we talk about the education, media, and the discourse, we can say that I will talk later on about the generational differences and social media revolution, but you can say that in the domestic discourse, there's a lot of discussion about the related with today's situation with what happened 100 years ago. And also another, if we're trying to put it at the dimension of the party-state relationship, we will say the ruling party's legitimacy is actually highly dependent upon somehow dressing itself as a safeguard or defender of China's national sovereignty. And the party got this, kind of legitimacy based on a tougher foreign policy. And they also need to use nationalism for the purpose of mobilization and social cohesion. And also, if we talk about the interactions between China and outside world, we can say that in recent years, there's also a rising anti-China nationalism, especially in China's regional neighbors. Based on some of the public opinion polls of the several countries surrounding China, even including Taiwan and Hong Kong, you can say there's a very obvious this kind of negative image about China in the regional area. But I think I just want to talk a little bit about this is, I think when people talking about China, sometimes if we use many of the media reports as example, I think people focus too much on the government, but sometimes overlooked the major transformation which is currently going on in China in the society level. Especially, we talk about the social media revolution. It's really a major change in China. Today, very few people in China, they rely on the official media, the official documents to get the information. The smartphone, like I put it here, it's a very high percentage of people in China now using internet and also using the social media and to get their information. So you can say that the China's social media, like the WeChat, Weibo, is getting very popular, and a lot of people, they rely on this social media to get their information, which is actually, we can say that, for example, I just gave you an example that people always talk about global times. I just following the Weibo and both Weibo and Weixin of the chief editor of Global Times. If we only look at the official media, you can say like a person like Hu Xijing, the chief editor of the Global Times, is very influential. And also, but if you look at the social media, you can say that very often whenever he posts a message, he got more people criticize him. And very often he is indefensive. And also, I think because of this reason, the government, the ruling party, they felt great pressure. And they found this area is really difficult for them to control. And so that's also the reason we can say that in recent years, especially after Xi Jinping came into power, there is a tighter censorship or repression in the media and including the social media. I think this is basically because the government felt the great pressure from the social level. And also another tendency is that we say that in China there is really a major, I call it going abroad rush in China. I just listed here like the visitors to Japan. I just came back from Japan. I see there's a huge amount of Chinese tourists in Japan. And also their spending is also increasing very quickly. And I don't think I need to mention this, especially at Harvard, that the Chinese students that last year's number is that Chinese students is over 30% of the total overseas students, international students globally. And there's more and more of the Chinese students going back to China. So basically, I think what I'm trying to say is, maybe this is not very clear. I just think there's a two tendency. At the state level, government level, maybe we say the tighter repression and the government foreign policy is also more aggressive. But at the society level, I think the tendency, the direction of the movement is the Chinese society is moving to more diverse, more global, more opening up, and this tendency, I think, is very difficult to reverse. So basically, I think maybe like we talked about, if we talked about the China issues today, there's many of the negative report, and also people are very concerned about the Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics. But if we look at the society level, I think there's maybe the story is a little bit different. And of course, we will say whether the state and society, there will be, adaptation or there will be future conflict. But basically, like I mentioned earlier, I think that in the next 5 years is probably quite a dangerous period of time. But after that, if we could have a peaceful 5 years, the future, I think, is still positive. Maybe I end up here. Thank you.
So we're very delighted to welcome Victor Cha, who joins us from Logan.
Do you want me to go from here or
Yes, if you could stand.
stand? Okay. Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here. I apologize for being late. My flight, I came in from Korea and I had to go through New York, and everything went fine until I got to the JetBlue baggage claim in Logan Airport, which just was not cooperative at all. So I apologize for being late. Susan asked me to talk about the Korean Peninsula, and I feel somewhat well positioned to do that since I was there yesterday or today. So let me offer a few remarks with regard to that. The first is on I'll start with the alliance. And there in particular, I was really quite surprised at how everybody has been thrown into knots by some comments that a couple of the presidential candidates have made. Actually from both the Republican and the Democratic side. Obviously, on the Republican side, comments that sounded anti-alliance in tone, and then on the Democratic side, comments that sounded anti-trade in tone. And I think both of these things worry certainly the allies in the region. The way I tried to explain it was that I think when we think about the U.S. alliance and alliance with Korea going into the future, there are sort of two ways to think about alliances, right? One way to think about them is to really think about them in very transactional terms, right? That essentially these security institutions are created for a very specific purpose, right? To deal with a particular threat or a particular problem. And then once that threat goes away, then the alliance is no longer necessary, right? It's a basic sort of cost-benefit calculation of the alliance. There are no permanent allies, right? There are only permanent interests, in the words of Lord Palmerston. And, arguably some of the comments that have been made during the campaign give that impression of a very transactional view of alliances. But I think many would agree that that's not the way we think about U.S. alliances in Asia. Alliances are security institutions, but they're security institutions that are more than transactional. In many ways, their core is the security bargain. But outside of that security bargain, there's a halo effect, right? A halo effect in the sense that the utility of these institutions is measured not just in the discrete security benefits, but in the non-security benefits that also come with these relationships. These non-security benefits can be exclusive to alliance partners, so things like the free trade agreement, foreign direct investment, visa waiver. These are exclusive benefits, non-security exclusive benefits that come to the alliance. Hyundai is the biggest employer in Alabama. Kia is the biggest employer in Georgia. I mean, these are all discrete, exclusive, non-security benefits. But there are also non-security benefits that are inclusive, right? Benefits that accrue to a wider community. In international relations terminology, that provide public goods or contribute to the provision of public goods that go beyond simply the bilateral alliance contract. And that means things like in areas like overseas development assistance, in nuclear security and safety, in climate change, right? These are all areas where the alliance contributes to helping to both shape the rules and norms that we think are important to carry on into the future. And so I think the debate going forward will be, and the debate during the campaign as it moves to the general election and starts to talk more about foreign policy, will be, what sort of vision of alliances do these candidates have as they look to the future? Do they see them in very transactional terms, or do they see them as being something that's much more than simply looking at alliances in terms of the discrete security transactional benefits? I would say for the most part, the view I think that I certainly believe, and that I'm sure many others, is that these alliances are more than simply a discrete security transaction, that they play a much broader role, and that they're very important to U.S. leadership in the region and in the world. We often forget, and perhaps some of the candidates forget, that leadership is not unilateral, right? Leadership is relational, right? You cannot be a leader without having partners or without having compatriots. And so the notion that one can lead unilaterally is not a notion that is going to be successful. I think there's some very specific things that the U.S.-Korean alliance need to focus on going into the future, and I'll just tick off a couple of these now just to put them on the table if you'd like to have a discussion about them. But the first is, I think, the defense relationship is strong between the United States and Korea, but it really needs to move out of the post-9/11 agenda, right? And one could arguably say this about security studies more broadly at academic institutions and think tanks around the world. We're very much stuck in a post-9/11 agenda, and we really need to move that. And the alliance needs to move beyond that. And when we're talking about areas like space cooperation, cybersecurity, robotics, these sorts of areas. The transfer of operational control from the U.S. to the ROK is something that still has been delayed, and I think will be part of the next administration's agenda. Given the North Korean threat, which I'll talk about in a minute, missile defense is clearly another area of major cooperation going forward between the United States and South Korea, as well as trilaterally among the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And then I think another important area of cooperation in the alliance is in terms of reaching out to China when it comes to thinking about the Korean Peninsula. Some of you probably have participated in these events, but there is much more willingness on the part of the Chinese now, both expert level and also track 1 level, to engage in trilateral U.S., Korea, China dialogue about the future of the Korean Peninsula. We just actually held one a little over a week ago at CSIS that involved both Chinese government officials as well as experts from the three countries with a very focused discussion on the Korean Peninsula. And that is something that's been very hard to do in the past, but increasingly it's going to be, I think, another important area for the alliance in terms of cooperation. Let me talk briefly about North Korea. So what's there to say? It's the situation is not good, and I don't see it getting better anytime soon. I think the narrative that we see in some of the press or the analysis is correct in the sense that we see a dramatic increase in the tempo of North Korean WMD demonstrations since January of 2016. That is not driven by external events, but driven by internal events, which is the desire for the leadership to establish its credibility in time for the May Party Congress, right? The 7th Party Congress, which is the first meeting of the Communist Party in over 30 years. This is a very important event for Kim Jong-un, and there is, I think, a desire to fully establish themselves as a nuclear weapon state in advance of the 7th Party Congress, such that in the 7th Party Congress they can focus on what they plan to focus on, which is the second part of the second half of the Byungjin Doctrine, which is economic development and prosperity. Right? So I think the 7th Party Congress is next week, May 6th. So I fully expect that we'll see more North Korean WMD demonstrations before that, especially since the last 3 have failed. The medium-range ballistic missile launches, all 3 of them have failed. But I think there'll be a lot of dissonance on May 6th because when the Party Congress meets, I think the entire focus is going to be on economic development, with the assumption that they have achieved the first part of their doctrine, which is nuclear weapon status. In terms of the road going forward, I think right now we're sort of caught in these twin dilemmas. On the North Korean side, the dilemma is the dilemma of legitimacy. And what I mean there is that Kim Jong-un came into power suddenly, and perhaps he really did want to focus legitimacy, his rule, on economic development and economic growth. It's entirely plausible that that's what he wanted to do. But that was not successful. So because it was not successful, he increasingly focused on development of the nuclear weapons program as the proxy for legitimacy. The dilemma, of course, is the more he focuses on nuclear weapons as the proxy, the more this encourages sanctions from the rest of the world, including China, and the more that makes that impossible for him to ever legitimize his regime based on economic development. So it's a negative spiral that just keeps getting worse and worse. And I think on the US side, we're caught in a bit of a dilemma as well. It's the dilemma of underreaction, right? The dilemma of underreaction, and what I mean there is that when in the past, when North Korea did nuclear tests or ballistic missile tests, everybody's hair would catch on fire, and people would raise great concerns about a crisis, and there'd be a call for emergency negotiations and all these sorts of things. And I think that what that created within the U.S. policy community, including the U.S. government, was a tendency a desire to underreact. In other words, we're not going to let North Korea pull us around by continuing to do these tests. We're not going to let them lead us around by the nose by doing a provocation every time they want to get U.S. attention. And so this created a dynamic where the policy community chose to underreact to North Korean nuclear and WMD capabilities in part because they saw it as a bargaining tactic and also because the weapons were not that advanced, right? And so I think right now we're kind of fallen into a dilemma of underreaction, which is that we continue to seek to underreact and not give North Korea the attention they desire by when they carry out these demonstrations. But it is now at a time when their weapons program has advanced quite a bit. And because we seek to avoid overreaction, I think we have now a tendency to underreact. So you have the North Korean legitimacy spiral and our underreaction spiral all happening at a time when we have elections here in the United States, right? Which it does not provide the best atmosphere for policymakers to think about diplomacy, to think about an exit ramp going forward. So I should have started with South Korea, because if I end with North Korea, it's always so negative. So going forward, I'm actually quite concerned, because I do think that there will be another, perhaps a fifth nuclear test before the Seventh Party Congress, which is on May 6th. I think that the U.S. and the ROK have another set of military exercises in August, which the North Koreans will probably respond to. And then we are full on into our election season in the United States. And that's not good either, because one of the things that we're doing at CSIS is we are collecting all the data that we can on North Korean behavior. So anywhere we can find data on North Korean behavior, we're collecting it, because most of the time when we talk about with North Korea, we're just making guesses, we're just making hunches. So we've decided to do a big project to collect as much data as we can. And one of the things that we've done is collect all the data on North Korean behavior around the time of both US and South Korean elections. And if you look back over time, it's not causal, but if you look back over time, there's a clear pattern there. There is a clear correlation between North Korean WMD demonstrations and US congressional and presidential elections, as well as South Korean presidential and National Assembly elections. So what that spells, what that points to going forward is the summer will not be a good time, because the North will be reacting to US exercises. And then we get into the fall and the winter, because of the US presidential elections, there's I think a tendency for the North Koreans to respond to that, either to shake up the new administration, to try to make sure that the administration focuses on them as an important issue going forward. But it's not very positive. All right, let me finish by, I'll say one thing positive about North Korea. And the one positive thing when you look at North Korea is, if you look at the politics and the economics, if you look at the politics, it doesn't look like a lot has changed. But if you look at society, right, there's been change. I mean, if you had to pick one variable that's a variable for change inside of North Korea today, it's North Korean society, right? North Korean society, which has clearly become, it's changed because of the private economy. There's an official market, but there's also a private market, and there are black markets, there are unofficial markets that have really become an important part of the society. The government doesn't like it, but they cannot clamp down on these markets, because they essentially allow the economy to continue. It takes pressure off the official economy because of this unofficial economy. And anytime you have a market that develops in any society, and even in a closed society, civil societies, right, grow up around markets, right? Civil societies develop around markets. And then if you add in a little bit of information technology, which we're seeing in North Korea, it's not a lot, but it's a little bit of information technology, then you start seeing civil society organizing around the price of the price of rice in the official market versus in the black market. Right? Where's the best place to buy cabbage, right? People are communicating with each other about things that have to do with personal livelihood outside of service to the government. And that's an important change. and it is about 20 years old now, and that's only going to continue to grow. And so that's something that we have to watch very carefully. The demand for information about the outside world is growing inside of North Korea among this consumer class. And while nobody can predict revolution or anything of that nature, what we have seen in the past is that every 10 years or so, the North Korean government gets uncomfortable with the amount of cash that is floating around in the economy, and they try to do something to stop it. They redenominate the currency. They try to basically flush all of the excess cash out of the system. And the times that we've heard about, anecdotally heard about resistance have been on those occasions when the government has tried to do something like that. So I think it's just a dynamic to watch going forward into the future. But it is something that speaks to I think the resiliency of the North Korean people and North Korean society to try to find a way to do better despite the horrific conditions under which they are put. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And we'll have now our final presentation by Sheila Smith.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm delighted to be back at Harvard and always pleased to see so many familiar faces in the audience. My assignment today was to really talk about where East Asia may be headed, but particularly the view from Washington, D.C. So I took my assignment to heart. It made me reflect just a little bit on the fact that I arrived in Washington, D.C. in January of 2008. So I have been there now for two Obama administrations. It goes without saying that this is the last year of President Obama's time in office. And as everybody here has reflected and noted, we are in the middle of a presidential election. So next January, I think, will be a critical turning point for our debate, not only on Asia, but on foreign policy writ large. And I think this is going to be an important election for testing the American people's sense of where they're headed and where they want to head. It may not be a foreign policy election, but it's certainly going to be an interesting time to check in on the American public and see where either Trump or Clinton is wanting to take them. I don't want to jump to a general election, but I think we're probably headed in that direction at this point. In the remaining months of the Obama presidency, though, you'll see him go to Japan for the G7. I anticipate he will be going to Hiroshima. We can certainly talk about that. There is also the possibility that there is a lame duck session at the end of the year in which TPP will be considered. So there's a couple of pieces of the puzzle in the Obama rebalance or the Obama Asia policy that we have to look forward to in the months ahead. But what I thought I would do here is, it's been kind of fascinating for me as a non-policy, non-governmental person to watch the way policy is made and also to watch the way it is not implemented from the vantage point that I sit at CFR. You know, when I came in, when I arrived in January 2008, of course, we were still in the middle of our election. But very soon after President Obama took office in 2008, we knew that the rebalance was underway. The Asia policy team, whether we called it a pivot or a rebalance, it doesn't really matter, but we knew that there was going to be a priority placed on Asia, and it was going to be an attempt to reorient or rebalance American priorities, right? So that we were going to be less entangled in the Middle East. We were going to think of our long-term ambitions, invest in a strategy that would plant us firmly in the future center of the global economy, which was in the Asia Pacific. And we were going to rebalance our strategic commitments with our partners, not only in East Asia, but also in Southeast Asia, right? A few weeks ago, I don't know how many of you read The Atlantic magazine, but President Obama was interviewed by Jeff Goldberg. It was a very extensive interview. If you'd like to take a look at the Obama Doctrine, which is what this issue is called, Jeff Goldberg spent a lot of time talking to the president about what his doctrine was. There's very little about an Asia rebalance. There's a lot about Syria. There's a lot about Crimea, Ukraine, red lines, the use of force. It's a very interesting article to get at the president's thinking about his time in office. But Jeff Goldberg came to CFR to talk to us about other things, and some of us asked him, why wasn't there more about Asia? And he said, I wanted to put it in, but there was just too much of the other stuff to talk about. So I think it's interesting, though, and I'm not saying this as a critique of the president, but to remember that sometimes events drive presidential politics or presidential policy in ways that don't necessarily conform to the ambitions of the president or the administration as they're coming in. It might be useful just to remember when President Obama came in, and especially his Asia team, and it was led by Secretary Clinton at the State Department. Very quickly, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was to be signed by the United States, the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, right? In Southeast Asia, of course, the focus was to turn to Burma, right? And change our relationship there, but also to establish a firmer bilateral set of bilaterals, but also institutional relationship with the ASEAN. Not to denigrate the relationships of Northeast Asia, but to sort of rebalance the way the American foreign policy in Asia had been prioritized. High on the Obama administration's list, of course, was participation in the East Asia Summit. The United States would not just sit and watch multilateralism develop in Asia, but it would participate. It would help and support institution building, norm creation. It would be at the table as the East Asia Summit was developed. So that was the ambition, and large part that got carried out. Over time, there was a military component to it as well that we saw emerging. It was largely to disperse our military, to reorient in a larger way, not from bases but to places, to be able to visit different parts of the region and the globe, to move away from a Cold War orientation of the way we are forward deployed and to develop partners in the region. And that you saw also. You saw a lot of language about political sustainability of the U.S. military presence, particularly in Asia. And in large part, most of us in this room understand that there was a long-standing problem in Okinawa, but also there were other issues as well. On the economic front, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was the centerpiece, I think, of the Obama administration's effort to make sure that the United States was firmly economically anchored in Asia, in trade, investment, and across the board, in what they were calling a high standards trade agreement, one that went far, far further than the NAFTA did, but that really brought labor standards and environmental standards into our trading relationships. And of course, that did not begin, remember, with the Obama administration. It began at the demand of other countries under the Bush administration. But this was something that I think the Obama team felt very strong about. So you're seeing us in the last 6 months to go now. And there are two metrics here. TPP, can he do it? Will he do it? And all of a sudden, you're seeing a presidential election here, which I'll get back to at the end, that is really bringing up this deep question about American attitudes towards trade. And they are obviously going to affect the next president, whichever person wins the election. They are going to deal with the campaigning and the questioning of the validity of our international trade commitments, the ones that exist now, but the ones that could be ahead of us in the future. So those are my main reason to go back to the Obama administration is because I was there in 2008 and I listened to the conversation. But also you can see that despite all kinds of ambitions for what you'd like to do, often events in the region take over, right? Events outside of Asia took over, of course. And I won't talk about that here because everybody here reads the newspaper and you know what happened. But let me say two focal points I think are pretty important, especially this year as we think about our Asia policy as it stands. One is obviously North Korea. It's striking to me that if you talk to our diplomats in the State Department last year about Asia, it was all about the 70th anniversary. It was all about the summitry that accompanied the 70th anniversary. It was all about navigating the politics of war legacy and war memory in Asia, and of trying to facilitate conversations between our allies, but also to encourage China to be in a more, let's say, optimistic mode when it looked forward instead of backwards. January 2016. And North Korea still steals the show, quite literally, again with nuclear tests and missile tests. And I think Victor has done a great job of helping us understand that conversation. All I'll say is when you sit in Washington and listen to our debate, not what's going on out there on the Korean Peninsula, I can sense a great deal of frustration. And it's not just Democrats versus Republicans frustration. It's really frustration about our inability thus far to stop the nuclear program in the North, and our inability to really effectively persuade China that it's in its interests to act more forcibly to sanction North Korea, despite China's commitment in the United Nations. It has not actually been very proactive in sanctioning the North. So you have two levels of frustration here. One is the problem-solving frustration, which is we haven't stopped, and in fact, the weaponry that North Korea maintains is more lethal today than it ever was. And the second is our inability to get China at the table in the same way we would have really liked to have had them there. There's also been, of course, less obvious, and you hear about it much less inside the Washington conversation, but there's been thresholds crossed in Asia itself. And so this is a little bit more of a quiet piece of the puzzle, but it's useful to remember that in 2010, of course, we had the provocations against the South by the North. We had the development of a counter-provocation strategy in the alliance, right, in addition to the full-on war planning effort. Japan, much earlier than the Obama administration, invested in ballistic missile defenses, but there's been a very quiet conversation still in Japan about what's euphemistically thought of as an active missile defense program, which is the acquisition of some kind of missile capability that would help the Japanese feel more secure. The alliance has undergone a pretty thorough revision. Our military cooperation with Japan has been revised. The guidelines have been revised. And of course, the US and China have gone through their conversations that sometimes expectations of China were very, but those expectations have diminished considerably, despite the fact that Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Washington a month or so ago to help facilitate the UN sanctions that have just been passed. The second focal point, of course, in the region has been China's rise, and we could spend an awful lot talking about this here, and many of you here are expert in this conversation already. I think, clearly I've written about this in my book, but the island dispute between Japan and China really refocused Japanese attention, as well as our attention, on the fact that you could realistically experience some kind of event, miscalculation perhaps, inadvertent perhaps, that would lead to a use of force incident, the use of force between Japan and China. And that was the first time for this alliance. And I've said that here at other moments before, but it transformed the way the United States and Japan had to think about how their alliance might work. It's always been a little bit of Washington's effort is to pull Japan along, do more, invest more, right? Help us more. But in the conversation we're having today, it's a little bit more about crisis management, about how to avoid escalation to conflict, and about how to recalibrate the alliance so that we understand the kinds of politics in both of our countries, but particularly in Tokyo, that might get us into a moment of deep political tension. And in Southeast Asia, of course, now we're watching the South China Sea. We're very focused at the moment on the South China Sea. For those of you who followed the Xi visit to Washington last fall, you'll know that the South China Sea was one of the more difficult issues on the agenda between our two presidents. But also in the region, the Philippines, Vietnam, the ASEAN countries themselves are all becoming much more interested in a very proactive American role in trying to respond to the Chinese behavior. It's interesting to me to watch Malaysia, Indonesia, countries that have never really had much of a problem with China, try to contend with the presence of Chinese Coast Guard vessels in their waters. But the Philippine case is the case of the moment. As many of you know, the Philippines decided to take China to UNCLOS, to a tribunal, for arbitration of the maritime disputes. We can certainly talk about the details of that arbitration case, but the result of that case is due sometime in June. And again, it's an issue of great sensitivity for the Chinese as well. Let me talk a little bit about U.S.-China, since we haven't really focused on that much in the panel, and I'll do it very briefly. Obama and Xi Jinping came to power in China when Obama was president. And the first idea, one of the many ideas, was to elevate the conversation between the United States and China to a leaders level dialogue. We have, as you know, a security and economic dialogue. 200 or many hundreds of Chinese government officials come to Washington, many hundreds of American officials go to Beijing. So we have a government to government, very in-depth conversation. But I think with the new leader of China, the president wanted to see if he could establish a little bit of a one-on-one conversation. And that was what took place in Sunnylands several years ago. If you contrast the Sunnylands meeting with last fall's visit by Xi to to Washington, you'll see just how strained I think the relationship has become. It's always been complex. It's never been easy. So it wouldn't be right to say it was easy and it got worse. But I think what's being highlighted now are some of the critical differences and interests that we have. It also, of course, took place after a major cyber attack on the US government in anticipation, right, of the NGO law being passed by China. There was a lot of concern about what that would mean for the people-to-people aspect of our relationship, and of course the maritime differences on the South China Sea. I think we're caught a little bit, to be quite blunt, in a tit for tat. Victor was talking about the dilemmas and the off cycles that we are with North Korea, but we are a little bit caught in a tit for tat at the moment in the South China Sea with China. The arbitration case is coming in June. There's anticipation that there's going to be behaviors in and around the Scarborough Shoal off the Philippines. You will probably have read in the headlines that our Defense Secretary, Ash Carter, was in the Philippines. We've got new deployments in the Philippines now in anticipation. So there's a little ratcheting up of tensions here, and I think people are holding their breath just a little bit between now and June. I think there's ample reason to believe that this could get a little bit unpleasant if the Chinese and the United States militaries decided to stand off with each other. But the real dilemma here over the long term, not just between now and June, but over the long term on the maritime issues, is how do you build common and shared norms of maritime behavior if one country's interests are actually not congruent to the others? And I think that's where you get the rising power status quo dynamic. It's in China, and the manifestation of this in the maritime domain, I think, is pretty obvious. For the United States, the policy dilemma is how to build collective action, not alliances, not defense commitments, and not the use of force, but how do you get to the table the countries of ASEAN, other maritime powers, and how do you get them to work with you alongside an attempt to engage China in the conversation, and where do you draw the line? And I think this is a very tricky area. I think we're going to have this issue in front of us for a long time. I think we do have colleagues and some very constructive suggestions from Australia, from India, from Japan. I think it's one of the areas where the U.S. and Japan have actually had some very positive conversations about what is possible going forward. I think the strategies are pretty shared. Transparency, opening up the maritime domain, which is Washington speak for, let's get some light on what's happening out there. Let's make sure everybody understands what's happening in their own waters. Let's make sure everybody in the region has the capabilities to at least police those waters, if not necessarily to engage in military action. But again, to show you the differences, you only have to go back to Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Washington several weeks ago. He was at CSIS, and it's online. Of the 30 minutes of Q&A, the foreign minister spent 13 minutes on the Philippine arbitration case. So you can feel the tension. He also talked about other things, which we can talk about, but you can feel the tension over this question of arbitration and what it means for China and what China will and will not accept from the tribunal. Let me close here with a couple of observations, and Susan asked me to look ahead. So I told her in Washington we only look to November. This is as far ahead as we can see at the moment. But I think our politics here are not about the specific candidates, although they are quite colorful, at least one of them. But it has raised, I think, in the public reaction to the campaign here, I think it's raised some critical issues. And again, other speakers have alluded to this, that will be with us far beyond whoever is president in the next term. I think there's a challenge to the bipartisan consensus, clearly in Asia in two particular ways. And I think, again, our speakers have talked about this, so I'll be very brief. One is on trade, and the other is on the alliances, on security. I think you will see Secretary Clinton in the general election maybe not endorse all of the Obama rebalance, but she will inherit it, and she will attempt to push it further and further ahead, and perhaps with a little bit more strength. I think on the alliances, we have a fundamental debate ahead of us, I think. And I suggest to my Japanese and Korean colleagues when this gets raised, and it gets raised immediately in every meeting, that if there is a President Trump, then they should be well prepared to argue the case for their alliance. But there is also, as Victor pointed out, the transactional approach. There's very few people in Washington who subscribe to the transactional approach. But we do have the politics of burden sharing behind us. We do have in our Congress, to be realistic, some real sense of the need for a more cost-effective sharing of the costs of strategy. And I think you are going to see a little bit more of that conversation regardless of who wins our general election. I was up on the Hill a few weeks ago at the U.S.-China Security and Economic Cooperation Committee hearings on the rebalance. They were evaluating the rebalance. You can look at them online. A lot of people were invited. But very clearly, people who had been appointed to that commission by Nancy Pelosi and people who had been appointed and represented the Republicans in Congress, they asked the same questions. They asked them slightly differently, but they were really asking some of the same questions about, and they're really taking us back a little bit to the burden sharing debate and the equities in the alliance. I think, in conclusion, trade and security in Asia will in large part depend on the ability of our leaders to form alliances themselves. I think the biggest challenge, not only in this presidential election, but in our Congress, is that the long-term consensus on trade in the Republican Party in particular is no longer in existence. And what you have now is a constituency by constituency coalition of representatives who believe firmly that their constituency is better served by foreign direct investment, by trade, and by globalization. But there are those states whose economies have yet to see the benefits of globalization and trade and investment. And that's where you see the dividing line eke out. And I think you're going to see that for a long time to come. So our job here is to move the agenda forward, not only in the grand meta theory about what our Asia policy should look like, but to demonstrate that our Asia policy is good for Americans, and good in the sense that most Americans can see the benefits of it. And I think that's really what this election is going to be all about in terms of our foreign policy, not specific necessarily to Asia, but including some of the conversations, the topics that we talk about when we think about our priorities in Asia. Let me stop there. Thank you, Susan, very much.
Terrific. Well, let us now open things up. And may I ask you to direct your question, hopefully, to just one of the speakers? And could you identify yourself not only by, if in the case of visitors, your affiliation here, but your affiliation in your rest of your normal life? Mr. Nakagawa of the National Police Agency.
Thank you very much. My name is Nakagawa, Associate of U.S.-Japan Relations. I would like to ask you, Takahara Sensei, apart from the Senkaku issue, but focused on the ethnic issues. Historically, not problems abroad, but problems at home collapsed the dynasty in Chinese continent. China has been strong against the danger from outside. Then how will communist dictatorship control and oppress the ethnic uprising? I expect it is impossible to restrain the huge uprising of the oppressed ethnic groups for more than, let's say, 100 years. My groundless guess is 15 years. Some critics say we don't have to be worried about its expansionism. It will ruin of itself. How do you think that problem? Takahara Sensei.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the question. The ethnic uprisings or the ethnic issues has been a very serious challenge for the stability of the political system in China. You know, even today, when you ride an underground, a subway in Beijing, you have to have your bag go through the checking machine, just like when you take on an airplane. And I think, you know, it is extremely difficult to completely suppress the ethnic movements, but that is what the current administration has been trying to do. And, you know, without the development of multiculturalism, I think it's impossible to completely get rid of the current issues that the administration is facing. So I think the contradiction or the problem is going to last for a very long time to come. But on the other hand, can those ethnic groups that want independence or that claim other rights, can they change the minds of the leaders in the central government? That's very difficult to foresee because I'm just talking about the power balance. So this kind of a situation that we are facing today, I should think, will last for a very long time to come.
Ted Bester, Department of Anthropology.
Hi, thank you very much. Extremely interesting discussion and covers a lot of ground. I'm going to be a parochial American and return this again to the election issues. But what I'd like to ask each of the panelists, if they care to respond, is how are the U.S. elections viewed by Japanese, Chinese, Korean policymakers and politicians? I mean, we've heard many interesting things, including Victor Cha's discussion of the propensity of North Korea to stage demonstrations when elections are going on. Sheila Smith, of course, talked about a lot of maritime issues. But I don't know quite how to phrase the question properly, but what I'd like to know is what Asian leaders think the consequences of the election will be. In other words, are they thinking about President Trump? Are they thinking about President Cruz? Are they thinking about President Clinton? And if so, what are they thinking about any of those possibilities regarding their own stake in multilateral relations in the Asia Pacific?
Victor, would you like to lead off?
Sure. So these are impressions. There's no scientific basis to what I'm saying now, but so I think that when it comes to so my impression is that of the candidates that are out there now, the one they would probably feel most comfortable with right now, I guess this is on the record, is probably Secretary Clinton. However, they're very concerned about her position on TPP, which seems completely at odds with where she was as Secretary of State. And I think so for many, they hope that's just politics and that if she is the president, she'll have a different view on TPP and trade more broadly. And when it comes to the Republican side, I think there's a great deal of concern. They really don't know what to expect from Ted Cruz, and they certainly don't know what to expect from a Donald Trump. And so I was really actually quite surprised when I landed in Seoul, 3 days ago, for one of these big, Koreans, they love to do conferences, right? So there's one of these big global conferences with all these foreign policy thinkers from around the world, and the entire conversation was about what Trump's comments about anti-alliance and the allies are not helping enough, and nuclearizing the allies, all these things, which to me just sound like silly remarks, but in Asia they take them very seriously. So I think there's a great deal of concern, a lot of hand-wringing. But I think Sheila is absolutely right. I mean, what I think policymakers and foreign policy thinkers in these countries need to be doing is they need to be ready to have, when whoever wins and you get into the transition period, that critical period from November to Inauguration Day, that's an absolutely critical period where for the president-elect to pull together the team, but then also to interact with them as they think about policy and strategy. They need to be ready to make the argument for why these alliances are in U.S. interests, both tactical and strategic interests.
Zheng, would you like to comment?
I think there's big or huge perception gaps. If I talk about the Chinese, how do they see the U.S. elections, and also, that during the debates, that China very often is a topic. So there's a big perception gap first. For example, that when different candidates criticize China's South China Sea policy or aggressive, but actually many people at home, they actually quite support Xi Jinping's South China Sea policy. And some of them even consider the government is not tough enough. There's a big perception gap that people very often they are not really pay attention to or trying to understand. Basically, I think the last year I stayed 3 months in China, and at one of the South China Sea research center, I talked with many people. I think basically most of the scholars I talked with or people I talked with, they just genuinely believe South China Sea belong to China. So this is, no matter whether you disagree, but this is a perception. This is public opinion. And also, if we talk about the candidates, the different candidates, which there's always, people are talking about that, even in the public media, you can see this kind of discussion. And I noticed one of the, public opinion survey somehow indicating the Chinese are considering, because actually each candidate is somehow criticizing China. Outcome to China. And so somehow I think meet the people's kind of like American conspiracy theory that Hillary is working on to building a network against China. This is quite popular opinions among many of the China's international relations scholars. Yeah.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything?
I should let Takahara go first on the Japanese side. Maybe. Yeah.
Thank you. I think many Japanese are simply amazed how popular Mr. Sanders and Mr. Trump are. We hear about the dissatisfaction amongst the population in America, but why? I mean, the economic situation seems a lot better than 8 years ago. The potential growth rate here is a lot higher than many other countries, including Japan or even China. So why are people so unhappy and dissatisfied? We're just puzzled. But anyway, I've never heard any Japanese say the possibility of President Trump. So I would guess that many people think Mrs. Clinton will win the election.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Shiro Kuriwaki. I'm a graduate student in Department of Government for Professor Takahara. You mentioned the common theme of Gokyohei, and other people make an analogy between the rise of Japan in the 1930s with the rise of China today. Do you think, as a historian of China and Japan, do you think this is a apt analogy, both in terms of China and its perception by its neighbors?
Yes, I think there is a growing concern, not only in Japan. First, it began in Japan, that Japanese historians began to compare the Japanese in the 1930s and the Chinese today. But now I hear more questions from the Chinese. Do you think that current China is similar to Japan in the 30s? And I think in certain ways, yes. But, times have changed. Now we are living in the 21st century. But what's worrisome is the fact that some Chinese leaders show the reactionary features, as it were, as if to bring us all back to the pre-World War II days, or even before. Some people even talk about the tributary system, which is even before that. So there is some concern about that, I must say.
Bill Overholt.
Bill Overholt from the Asia Center here. Is Abenomics working? And if it's not, are we headed to a great financial crisis in Japan? And would that be very upsetting if it occurred to alliances, to international relations, to the economics of the region in general?
Okay, I've been dubbed to take that. I'm happy to take that. Is it working? I think this year we can see that the instruments that he's brought to bear are not bearing fruit in the way he had expected them to do. So whether it's Governor Kuroda and monetary policy, or it's some of the effects of the stimulus. Right, he's not getting the kind of reaction that he had hoped to get. All that being said, I think a lot of the challenges of Abenomics, or what everybody seems to refer to as that third arrow, which is in fact many, many arrows of structural reform, and those are long time frame kind of transformations in Japan. I don't know if Yoshimasa Hayashi was talking about agricultural reform this morning or not, but the Japanese are moving in some very fundamental ways in the agriculture sector, for example. They are moving in terms of the participation of women in the workforce. There's large transformations that still need to go, but there's a lot of targets, right, that the Abe cabinet has set. That notwithstanding, on the private sector, a lot of the implementation burden lies on the private sector. So there's an election this summer. I think there'll be a little bit of a referendum on where the Abe cabinet is on Abenomics. I understand it's going to be an upper house only election, so that may change the tenor somewhat. But I think in terms of, I don't see financial crisis. Again, I'm not an economist, and there may be economists in the room better able to answer that question. But I don't see the alliance will come apart if Japan is economically troubled. But I think the vision that Mr. Abe has set out for Japan will be harder to implement.
Let's see, Mr. Sugimoto.
Thank you. I'm Koji Sugimoto, Associate of U.S.-Japan Program, and I am from Sankei Shimbun newspaper in Tokyo. My question is to Professor Victor Cha. I want to ask you a question about the U.S.-led alliance system called hub and spoke system. After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. ally enhanced defense cooperation with each other, without the United States. These phenomena cannot be seen during Cold War era. So my question is that there is possibility that these cooperation will transform the hub and spoke system into another system or not.
Well, thank you for the question, in no small part because it allows me to advertise my next book. I have a book coming out in August it's about the origins of the American alliance system in Asia, looking at Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. But the last chapter looks at exactly this question about the future. And so there have been three waves, right? The first wave was after the end of the Second World War, the creation of the hub and spokes design for Asia. And that was pretty much the architecture for Asia throughout the Cold War, right? And then with the end of the Cold War, you saw the growth of other forms of regional organizations, most of them generated by ASEAN and ASEAN countries. And then in the last decade, we've seen the China-led institutions growing in Asia. And so the big question looking forward is, how do these three pieces come together? I think you're right that really from the end of the Cold War, the primary way in which the U.S. bilateral alliance system changed was through what some people refer to as mini-lateralization, right? It went from these exclusive bilateral relationships to trilaterals, to quadrilaterals, to other sorts of formations, U.S., Japan, Korea, U.S., Japan, India. And most of those were directed towards providing some sort of public good, at least on the surface, some sort of public good, disaster response preparation, these sorts of things. And I think that we'll continue to see that happening with the U.S. alliance system. And I think it's going to continue to evolve in that direction. But I don't think that evolution is going to change the nature of the core bilateral security agreements. among the countries in the region. So in other words, if it's a hub and spokes, there'll be many more connections among the spokes. But I think still the core of that particular aspect of the regional architecture will still be these bilateral alliance relationships. The security core will always be there. At the end of the book, I don't think there are some who have argued that there is what's institutional balancing taking place. That's the term I think some scholars have used between particularly the China-led system, new system, and the U.S. system. And I don't think that's. I mean, I think that's one way of characterizing it. But I think what we're seeing is just the growth of many different types of institutions in Asia, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Right? I don't think it is a competition, and that in many ways, because Asia is so diverse, Asia today is not Western Europe after the Second World War. I mean, there's so much diversity, there's so much dynamism that you need complexity in Asia in terms of institutions. So I see them really coexisting with some overlap. Right, maybe areas where they don't overlap, but some overlap, and that messiness will be the architecture of Asia, the messiness. The last thing I'll say is that, while I think that the Chinese-led institutions, whether it's CICA or AAIB or One Belt One Road or all these, they are certainly framed as being very multilateral and non-exclusive in nature, and often juxtaposed to the U.S. alliance system, which is often described as selfish or exclusive. It just benefits certain people and not others. But if you look carefully at what China's building in Asia, particularly to the west in developing Asia, it is in a multilateral framework, but it's very bilateral. It's very hub and spokes. And I remember reading an analysis by one of the Asian country representatives who went to the last CICA summit, and his analysis basically was about how it looks like a big multilateral gathering, but if you look at the business that's taking place in something like CICA, it's all focused on China. It's all these countries with direct lines trying to get something from China. That's very hub and spokes. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just a footnote on that. I think we have to be careful not to over-exaggerate China-led institutions, right? So the AIIB got a lot of attention, right? As, this is the new order, this is the beginning of a China-led, right, growth of institutions. But I think if you look at the initial 5 or 6 projects that were announced by the AIIB are in Central Asia, and they are very complementary and have the support of the ADB. So there's been a very constructive dialogue between the Japanese leader of the ADB and the Chinese leader of the AIIB. I think sooner or later you're going to see this complementarity that Victor was suggesting evolve in even that new institution. And I think, again, there's demand for it in the region, and we shouldn't overreact in some ways to who's leading what. We should be paying careful attention, though, I think.
I wonder if I could ask Professor Wang, both you and Takahara-san have been very worried about the future direction for China. And one of the things that people worry about right now, or the basis for that kind of worry, is the new law that is making its way in terms of restricting NGOs. Mm-hmm. And of course, China's suppressed NGOs in various ways in Weibo and so on before. So what is it about this particular measure that we should be particularly worried about? And I'm also interested in who you believe the target is. It does create a sort of wall between the domestic NGOs and the international NGOs, and who is the real target? Ostensibly, the real target is international NGOs, but is the ultimate target domestic? I'm trying to understand how worried we should be.
Yes. In recent years, it's like I mentioned in my presentation, we can really say that this kind of more and more signs that the government is trying to tighten we can say tighten the screw of the control. I think there's one background maybe is useful for us to, or it's helpful for us to understand, including understanding Chinese nationalism, is Chinese domestic politics in the past 3 years is actually experiencing a major, I don't know how to describe it. It's not a normal situation. It's not a normal period of time. Basically, we can say the power transition after the 18th Congress hasn't been completed. We have a lot of signs that Xi Jinping is concentrating or solidarity in his power. But basically, for example, we look at the PLA as an example. How many generals has been moved from their positions? There's over 50 generals. So if we put the number together, those people, they lost their positions during the anti-corruption campaign. Of course, many of them, they're indeed very, they have a lot of corruption activities. But basically, we can say that this is a major political change, one of the biggest political change after the end of Cultural Revolution. So the ruling party, especially the top leadership, is in a situation very insecure. So that's also the reason she needs to grab more power. And of course, he also wants to do more things. So I think that probably explains some reason why in recent years that we can say that the government is trying to do everything to trying to have a tighter control, including not only just we talked about the media and also the NGOs. Because they have a big concern about so-called color revolution happened in China, and they don't want to, and also including, unthinkable control of the media and opinion, because they're worried about this is a very unstable period of time that anything can raise, can make bigger. Because one of the lessons the government drew from the 1989 is that a small incident can develop very quickly. So they have to tightly control it because they haven't, like I mentioned, they haven't passed this power transition period. And for the NGOs, I think it's one of the main background. Of course, I'm not expert on NGO, but I think one of the main background is that the government want to have more manageable, or they can, to control the NGOs from outside China, because they're worried about they may doing something, and in a stage maybe they cannot do something, so they want to make it to put a legal process. So maybe in the early stage they can intervene if they do something wrong, or if they do something not the government expecting. Yeah.
Did you want to come? Yes, Consul General Jimeno.
Thank you. I hesitate take the floor because there are many people who wanted to ask other questions, but with some remaining time, I'd like to pose a question to both Professor Wang and Professor Takahara particularly, but other comments will be welcome. This is particularly the Japanese, but the U.S. Policy reactions or approaches vis-a-vis China, combining security side and economic side. While we feel obliged to react to Chinese aggressiveness, but my focus is how can the United States and Japan, for example, to reach out to the other voices within China who may wish to see their national resources to put to non-military, expansionist, aggressive policies, but to create a more harmonious socio-economic policies, and how the United States and Japan can collaborate. If this is too naive, please honestly say so. But if there's any advice, that would be appreciated.
Okay. Yes, that's the way that we have to go. And there's no academic basis for what I'm going to say now, but I think if we could muddle through for, let's say, 20 years without any war, then we'll be all right. Because, but why? Because the Chinese people are changing. They're changing very rapidly, as we can see in this room. So how can we promote this change that's happening in society? I think that's the common task that we have, not only between Japan and the United States, but amongst all other nations. And we are very happy to see the increase in the number of Chinese tourists coming to Japan. It doubled last year from the previous year. Now, last year it was 5 million. And I've heard that in the first quarter of this year, there has been a 60% increase compared to the last year. So that is very promising, since once the Chinese people actually come to Japan, they can understand that what they hear about Japan in China is, a lot of that is propaganda. So direct contact, I think, is most important and most effective, and therefore I would like to ask all governments to increase some budget for youth exchange, intellectual exchange, and we should make good use of the internet, social networking services in order to keep up the contact, maintain the contact after these direct meetings take place.
If I may just add, yeah, I think it's a very important question, because actually all over the world is talking about how to respond to China's aggressiveness. But I think, like I mentioned earlier, I really have this kind of concern about a major misunderstanding and misjudgment. Because many people seems not really pay attention about the reasons or perceptions behind the so-called Chinese aggressiveness. Why they do that? The rationale, and the domestic opinions related with that. Another issue, I think, is if we talk about South China Sea, I think one of the issue is for example, maybe I put it this way: if the island building actions conducted China in recent months, if it's happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I think people probably will interpret it quite differently. And for example, if I talked with many of the Chinese scholars, they basically consider kind of like a make-up activities, because some other countries, Vietnam or Philippines, they already conducted this islands building. China's presence in the South China Sea is actually quite limited, even though China's policy being widely criticized. But China's presence in the South China Sea is very limited. China not conducting any, oil conduction, especially in the separately. So and also another background is Hu Jintao and the Wen Jiabao administration. They actually being heavily criticized domestic at home, being soft on South China Sea and on foreign policy. So I think this is probably one of the reasons the current government, they're trying to focus on, or they want to make it different with the previous administration. So basically, I think this is really a very important question, but I think that, like I mentioned earlier, there is a huge perception gap. And noticing, realizing, and understanding this perception gap should be, any reaction before people conducting any reaction. They should considering about that. Otherwise, like I mentioned, I'm really concerned about there is a major misunderstanding and misjudgment. And that's also the reason I mentioned next 5 years is very critical time, especially we talks about the result of the arbitration lawsuit probably will coming out soon. And actually, for anybody study Chinese international relations, we know that the outcome, if the outcome is not good to China, the Chinese government will consider it as a losing face or even another kind of humiliation. And their response were even tougher. They will make big response rather than some people expecting that China maybe, because the outcome is not positive to China, China maybe will, trying to make adjustment. I don't think so. They will do just the opposite. So that's probably is one of the critical issue, in the next months. Yeah.
Jing Kai. And then I have a question in the back, and those, I'm afraid, will be our last questions.
I'm Zheng Kai, a graduate student in government department here. My question is for Professor Cha. So wonder if you could comment on the prospect of Korean-Japan agreement on comfort women, particularly given Korean domestic opposition and the fact that Park Geun-hye no longer have a parliamentary majority, whether the agreement will sustain those domestic problems and maybe come to 2018, no matter it's Ban Ki-moon or other politicians involved in elections, whether those domestic politics would exacerbate the process between Korea and Japan. Thanks.
I'm sorry, what was the last part of the question about Ban Ki-moon?
With the looming 2018, with the looming election, whether those presidential elections in the presidential politics in Korea would change the discourse and the domestic political process over whether to implement this treaty or just to ditch it.
Okay.
Thanks.
So on the agreement itself, I did not expect that the two governments would be able to get an agreement while Park Geun-hye and Abe were in the leadership. I just did not expect that it would happen. And when it did happen, and you look at the agreement, I mean, I thought this was, given the situation both of them were in domestically, this was admirable. I mean, it showed that both sides really wanted to try to find some sort of resolution. Now, is the Korean public happy with it? Not particularly, right? The polling shows maybe it's 45-55, 40-60 in favor, right? On the Japanese side, is everybody happy with it? No. But, when you work in government and you come up with an agreement that nobody's happy with, it's probably a good agreement, right? If everybody's unhappy with it, that means there was a compromise, right? And I think there was a compromise in this agreement. Going forward, it's hard to say. Will this resolve the issue definitively between the two sides, at least in the court of public opinion? Of course not. I mean, it won't, unfortunately. However, I think that this agreement certainly advanced the ball from an official perspective of how the two countries have dealt with this issue. And so in that sense, I think it's important. It is. I don't think anybody would see it as not being progress in terms of trying to deal with this issue. President Park certainly is not in a strong position after her legislative elections. For those of you who don't know, there were just national elections in Korea a little over a week ago where, despite a split opposition, the ruling party lost in a big way. They lost their majority in a big way, and effectively rendering President Park a lame duck for the rest of her time in office. I don't think that means she will back off on the Comfort Woman Agreement. I think she agreed to it, and she has tried to support it and convince her constituency to support it as well. I think just because she has lost the national election, I don't think she'll back away from it. I think she will continue to stand by it. And in terms of the elections coming next year, for those of you who don't know, there are presidential elections in Korea next year, and the campaign for the presidential election started the day after the National Assembly election in South Korea. And right now, I mean, if you had to put a bet, because it looks like a progressive has a better chance of winning in South Korea in 2017 than the conservatives right now, if you look at it. But again, I don't think that will cause a new government to try to walk back previous agreements. They may not like the agreement, they may not agree with all of it, but I don't think that they'll try to walk it back, because that will create more problems than it will solve, I think, for any administration. But will this remain a contentious issue in spite of the agreement? I think so, absolutely. But from an official government perspective, this was a tangible step that went beyond where both sides were prior to the agreement. And in that sense, I think it's important.
I want to apologize to those of you who still had questions. I'm very sorry we're at the end of our time, and it's sort of my sad duty to bring things to a close, but I really want to thank the panel for coming through with very, very thought-provoking and forward-looking remarks. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming.